Beautiful. All right. Well, assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome back to day 3 of our Islamic Feminism intensive course. Uh, we're already at the halfway mark, alhamdulillah. So it's really exciting. And given the fact that this is the halfway mark, I think that today's lecture is the perfect fusion of the two sides that we're going down on the spectrum. We have really dug in over the past 2 days, traveling through the historical development of Islamic feminism with Dr. Maryam Cook. We examined the transformative power of reinterpreting the Quran yesterday with Dr. Asma Afsar and together, these sessions have shown us how deeply our histories and our sacred texts are intertwined with our visions for justice. And so now, as we start entering into contemporary Islamic feminism, today's session is what I think to be the ethical heart of the work that we're all doing, which is at the center of the questions of gender, power, and justice in Islamic thought. So, beyond the law and the text interpretations of Islam, Islamic ethics really invites us to reflect on how we embody justice, not just in spirituality, but also through our relationships, through social structures, and how we apply Islam to those different dimensions of our lives. Like some of the questions that I'm sure will come up are things along the lines of, what does it mean to create a society that upholds our human dignity? Not just in theory, but in daily life, especially with everything going on in the world today. How do we challenge the hierarchies, the power imbalances, the existing power structures that exist both in our communities and beyond that? So these are examples of some of the urgent, complex, and uncomfortable, frankly, questions that we as a cohort need to confront if we're serious about our future liberation. And we have no better intellectual here with us today to help us examine those questions than Dr. Zahra Ayobi. So in this essential exploration, Dr. Ayobi is going to be joining us from Dartmouth College, where she is an associate professor of religion. She's also a leading scholar in Islamic ethics and feminist philosophy. So we're very lucky to have her join us for this program. And she is really like one of the best minds for us to dig into on this, because her work has been groundbreaking in examining how classical Islamic texts conceptualize moral and ethical subjectivity um, around gender and how it's embodied through our faith. And she's done research that's challenged patriarchal readings of ethics in Islam. And her work really invites us to imagine that type of justice and moral excellence that Islam truly stands for. So we are so honored to learn from her today. And with that, Dr. Zahra, I would love to pass you the mic.
Thank you so much, Amani. I was not expecting such a lovely introduction, so thank you for that. It is absolute pleasure to be here. One of my favorite things is, as a scholar now, is to be speaking directly to Muslim audiences, and it is a pleasure to bring my research and my thoughts uh, into such a space, because I feel like this is the most generative space, and one in which, inshallah, I also hope to benefit from being able to be around you guys and learn from you guys with your questions and your comments. So at the outset of my lecture today, and I'm gonna lecture more so in the beginning and then pause for some questions and then continue some more lecture and then have something of an interactive discussion before taking further questions. If that works, I have some back and forth in terms of format. Um, so
Yeah, we will be having time after your lecture for a Q&A with all of our students, inshallah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, that's great. I would love to have that, and in addition to that, I'll pause the lecture a couple times as well to field some questions before I move on to other topics. So so at the outset of my lecture today, I'm going to discuss Islamic ethics, or even just ethics, right, as a construct or a category, a discursive tool for a few minutes, because it's not always included in descriptions of genres of Islamic thought or epistemology. Islamic ethics is an academic construct, which or a thing that people sort of put together as a category that isn't necessarily organic, but some would argue it is, and including myself, in within an Islamic tradition. So it's an academic construct in which scholars have variously used to describe the values imparted in various Muslim genres of Islamic tradition, right, including Quran, Hadith, and the intellectual ethics traditions of jurisprudence, fiqh, Sufism, theology, or kalam, and then philosophical ethics, or akhlaq, as well as literature and adab. So in addition to these prescriptive discourses, scholars also define Islamic ethics by Muslim praxis, right? So what Muslims actually do in their day-to-day lives also sometimes count as descriptions of Islamic ethics, right? It's like my ethic and your ethic are part of an Islamic ethic, right? And so in addition to that, so these descriptions of genres as Islamic ethics emphasize, however, what they all sort of have in common, is their focus on moral values and or practices that Muslims have distilled as the way to life, as the way to live a life according to an Islamic ethos. So it's not that Islamic ethics is anything that's Muslimy, right? But rather it's this methodological attention to the question of what principle, what value, what moral, right? What principle is at play in a given rule, in a given practice, in a given verse, or what is the essence of it that makes it Islamic, right? So in the interest of time, because otherwise we'll be here all day, I'll describe the sort of major ethical constructs associated with studying masculinity, femininity, gender relations that scholars have distilled across Quran and Hadith, and a little bit on Islamic jurisprudence, and a little bit on philosophical ethics, with sort of very broad strokes, before moving on to horizons and other things. And you're welcome to ask me more specific questions about any of these in Q&A. Um, so what I'm leaving out is discussions on mysticism and literature, even though those are very important genres in and of themselves to understand how religious tradition might be interpreted in Muslim life or in Muslim spiritual life, in particular. And so, you know, and I'm leaving those out mostly in the interest of time, but they also have a lot to say on the subject of ethics, or vice versa. Ethics has a lot to say about how these genres of thought and being and practice are incorporated into Muslim life, from a gender justice perspective. So what various scholarly descriptions of Islamic ethics have in common, as I said earlier, right, is that they describe moral values, practices, ways that Muslims have distilled life into in their Islamic ethos, whether or not they adhere to any specific or theoretical prescriptive discourse, right? So in other words, people may still insist on something being Islamic, even if it goes against something that's found in the Quran or Hadith or law or something, right? They may still say, oh, it's Islamic to do this or that, even if it's not something that's found in these texts, right? So that makes up this sentiment still makes up, or this underlying philosophy still is part of their Islamic ethos. So Islamic ethics then is best defined as an articulation of principles or values of what is Islamic for Muslims, either in theory or in praxis. And rather than complicating this picture, paying attention to the category of gender in Islamic ethics actually helps to clarify how how a belief or a practice which does not necessarily originate in scripture or law becomes Islamic. The origin of something believed to be ethical could be historical. It could be an influence of something adjacent, religiously or culturally, perhaps. But regardless, it is a deeply held belief that thinking philosophically can uncover. So, paying attention to the underlying philosophy of gender or gender ethics is then asking the question whether historically or now, how is life that is lived in accordance in accordance to an Islamic ethos gendered? How is that variable given a person's gender? So it is to pay attention to the deeply held philosophical ideas about how someone's gender affects how they are to live as a Muslim in the world, even if they themselves might be focused on preparation for the hereafter, or if even if somebody aspires to some sort of gender blind relationship with the divine, right? Living in the world is a gendered experience, and so how to live as a Muslim in this gendered world is also part of that. So, to be sure, attention to the category of gender emerged in Islamic studies through feminist work, right? Likewise, to study gender in Islamic ethics is to take a feminist standpoint. That is, to focus on how the discussions about how to be Muslim while inhabiting a gendered body has been a normative male one, right? So most scholars follow the lead of medieval Muslim thinkers for whom the whole universe is male dominion, to order the universe according to divine wishes, according to what God may want, right? Of course, there's a lot of guesswork involved in what God would want. And Muslim feminist ethics then becomes a category that we can use to classify Islamic ethics positions from a decidedly feminist standpoint, right? Even if various moments in which Muslim feminists have used the term ethics have sort of been disjointed. So that said, I would say that there are three main positions that faithful Muslims have taken in reading Quranic verses and hadith about gender roles. Those are of one, male superiority, two, of gender complementarity, the idea that the genders are complementary to each other, like this yin and yang concept, and then three would be gender equality, right? And some argue that the Quran and hadith support absolute male superiority, and others soften this sort of patriarchal blow by arguing that the scriptural tradition supports equal status in the eyes of God, but that God has created men and women with different natures that are best suited to different roles. The complementarity thesis holds that within these differing roles, men are the protectors and maintainers of women because of their essential natures, and thus have been burdened with power and strength and responsibility over women, whose roles are fulfilled in part by their nature to reproduce and nurture. And proponents of equality in the scriptural and interpretive tradition, including but not limited to feminist scholars, have argued that male superiority is a historical, philosophical paradigm of gender ethics in which the Quran and Hadith had a time-bound paradigm in which the Quran and Hadith emerged and have been interpreted. So examining the relationship between historical context and the Quran has produced sort of two distinct conclusions in feminist scholarship. On the one hand, Muslim feminist theologians have contextualized Quranic verses that propose hierarchical gender relations as a product of social norms of the 7th century Arabia, and propose that the universal egalitarian ethos of the Quran should be prioritized over historically specific gender hierarchical values. And Muslim interpreters of the scriptural tradition have utilized sort of a few methods to arrive at gender equality on the other hand, right? So feminist theologians such as Amina Wadud, Asma Barlas, and I'm sure you sort of discussed some of these names and figures yesterday, emphasize the overwhelming egalitarian worldview of the Quran and have critiqued the atomistic, hermeneutical model of traditional male-centered tafsir that focused on sort of linguistics of the Quran over its ethical core. And rather than values that are external to Islam, this ethical core of absolute egalitarianism emerges for these scholars, as from the Quran itself, and asking questions about what kind of society is yielded by belief in a just God and in the oneness of God, right? This egalitarianism also extends to those with non-binary gender identities and diverse sexualities. The idea that, according to Quranic ethics, all human beings are equal. Another method for arriving at gender equality within the Muslim feminist theology has been through a comparative religion approach. So, in recognizing that Muslim feminist theology has both highlighted the egalitarian ethos of the Quran and noted its gender egalitarian limitations, Jerusha Telamti draws on Christian scholar Kwok Pui-Lan's work on feminist imaginings of Jesus to propose that Muslim feminist theologians adopt a hybrid approach to the Quran, right? That is, viewing the Quran as a site of relationship, and embracing its complexities and ambiguities. And in doing so, the readers are able to recognize that the Quran is, quote, is divine and of this world. So it's both, it's a divine and of this world, and it is universal and revealed in response to a particular context. It is egalitarian and marked with androcentrism and patriarchy, sort of at the same time. Lamptey proposes that such an approach allows for additional egalitarian interpretations by, quote, refusing to privilege historical meaning or accumulated tradition, and approaching the historical meaning and tradition as a, quote, response, as responses to aspects of Quranic hybridity, but that they are not the only possible or legitimate responses. For Muslims, the example of the Prophet Muhammad also, peace be upon him, also serves as an important source of Islamic ethics. Scholar Kisha Ali has argued that both the Prophet Muhammad's own masculinity as well as his relationships with female members of his family serve as models for Muslim understanding of gender and gender relations, but that the interpretations of the prophetic ethics have changed over time and today exist in response to negative Western characterizations of the Prophet, peace be upon his biography. So, for instance, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was monogamously married to an older woman of 25 years, right? Khadija, right? Who financially supported him until her death. Throughout the rest of his lifetime, he married multiple women, all whom were widows, except one had not been previously married, and his polygyny never really was an issue in the context of biblical prophets, who also had multiple wives, until the modern period when that aspect of the prophet's biography was used to denigrate Muslim gender practices, even though polygyny is a highly regulated and extremely rare practice in Muslim communities, sort of globally speaking. So that's just an example of how things have shifted in interpretation of the prophet and the prophetic ethics. Interpretation among Muslims of the prophet's sayings and actions on women are a source of debate, right? Many point to his beautiful example of his comportment, his manners, his respect for women, his inclusion of them in the community, etc. These are not disputed per se, but many emphasize or interpret reports that seem to support reports of his sayings that seem to support male dominance in his example, especially in the political arena, right? In examining the historical context, the methodological issues that arise in examination of frequently cited hadith reports used to justify hierarchical gender relations and misogynistic attitudes of highly accredited transmitters, like scholars like Fatima Mirnasi, had argued that women's rights have been had never been incompatible with the Prophet's message in the Quran or the Quran, but simply because those rights conflict with interests of the male elite. Mirnisi argues that hadith and the chain of transmission of reports of Prophet Muhammad's sayings, right? So like the hadith, the matan and the isnad of the sayings that trace back to the Prophet or his companions served as a formidable political weapon used to maintain power of male elite after the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Mirnisi argues that the manipulation of hadith to uphold male authority was a, quote, structural characteristic of the practice of power in Muslim societies, since all power from the 7th century onward was mute that person so that I'm not. Okay, there we go. Okay, where was I? So Mirnisi argues that the manipulation of hadith to uphold male authority was a structural characteristic of the practice of power in Muslim societies, since all power from the 7th century onward was only legitimated by religion, at least for a time, for a long time. Political forces and economic interests push for the fabrication of false traditions. So there's, certain hadiths that she feels are weak in their isnad, the ones that are particularly misogynistic in nature. If we examine them, then they are rather weak. And so moving on to Islamic law and jurisprudence, right? As and when we think of them in terms of ethical discourse, right? Islamic jurisprudence is probably the most tangible and obvious genre of Islamic thought that dictates gender ethics, right? But it also responds to Muslim praxis, right? In the second sense of ethics, as praxis, as people's practices that I was discussing earlier, particularly through the apparatus of fatwas or legal responsa. Discourses on gender in Islamic jurisprudence are frequently discussed in relation to family and marriage law. For example, women's rights to divorce, inheritance, maintenance, education, employment, etc., etc. Fiqh has responded to contemporary debates on gender and women's rights through fatwas that either uphold, amend, or recontextualize classical Islamic jurisprudence on marriage and family law. However, based on analysis of classical fiqh on marriage, Keisha Ali argues that early jurists viewed fiqh on marriage as a contract. The parameters of this contract were based on jurists' environment and premised on the notion that women's maintenance was a condition of their sexual availability, as demonstrated in early rulings that compared marriage to slavery or to contractual sale. Feminist scholars like Ali have identified sort of two contemporary approaches for responding to gender hierarchical fiqh: neo-traditionalist on the one hand, and gender complementarism on the other hand, and feminist apologist as which are also sort of feminist apologist as Keisha Ali describes it. So neoconservative or neo-traditionalist scholars, and these are sort of labels that are sometimes can be problematic, but sort of more conservative scholars who have taken the complementarity position concede often that from the perspective of Allah, right, all human beings are equal. That is, they've been created by Allah and in the same way and will be judged by Allah using the same standards of weighing their deeds and misdeeds, right, in the hereafter. However, such scholars primarily understand that equality is limited to the divine perspective in the hereafter and not God's intent for earthly gender relations. On earth, they contend that according to the Quranic verse, particularly they quote 434, which is, become the infamously only known verse by number, unfortunately, in recent years, because of so much discussion about it. Right, so on earth, they contend that according to Quranic verses such as 434, God intended complementary roles for men and women, And in the complementarity thesis, men are the protectors and especially financial maintainers of women, who in turn are suited to feminine domestic roles. Scholar Ziba Mir Hosseini identifies a complementarity approach through Islamic gender relations that emerges out of Muslim authority figures' contradictory need to both defend and uphold traditionalist fiqh models of family and gender relations, while also being aware of and sensitive to criticisms of the patriarchal basis of Islamic law and the desire to ground gender egalitarianism as inherently Islamic, not Western or imported. So there's a lot of push and pull in this entire discussion about what Islamic law is doing and not doing, what the Quran is doing and not doing with respect to gender and the nature of gender, hierarchy of gender. That is, all of that is in conversation with Western critiques and allegations upon and years and years of stereotypes and allegations upon on Islam as being uniquely and especially a sexist religion. So that is all part of this context as well. The contradictions that arise from the gender complementarity thesis are illustrated when a single text argues for, quote, for gender equality on one issue, for example, women's education and employment, but rejecting it on another, for example, divorce, right? And that's Mir Hosseini in 2003. In addition, women's biological disposition or nature towards domestic work, or supposed nature towards domestic work, I should say, are often cited to support gender complementarism and defend classical fiqh. However, as Ali points out, that such arguments are inconsistent with classical fiqh, as early jurists concluded that domestic work was not a wife's responsibility, but just the sexual availability was. So ultimately, what these tensions expose is the internal contradictions and anachronisms of in fiqh rules on gender, which Mir Hosseini attributes to classical jurists as misconstructions of the concept of qiwama, which is traditionally translated as male guardianship. And based on sort of analysis of classical jurists' use of qiwama in family and marriage law, qiwama developed in accordance to sort of pre-Islamic marriage contracts and have mistakenly been understood as placing women under men's authority, with the result that they have become the building blocks of patriarchy within a Muslim legal tradition, right? So that the idea is that this is a historical artifact, right? That superiority and complementarity are historical issues, are historical artifacts. And I also mentioned feminist apologist approaches. So scholars who adopt feminist apologist approaches emphasize the importance of stipulations, right, and practical applications of marriage contracts, right? So, for example, the inclusion of stipulations in a nikah contract guarantee a woman's right to something, right? And depending on what is stipulated, right? Education, outside employment, within marriage contracts, right? However, as Ali argues, that such an approach misses the forest for the trees, right? Although potentially quite effective, right? And so I'm not knocking this idea of being able to include stipulations in nikah contracts, right? So the potentially quite effective in securing rights, women's rights, they which may not be respected, right, in a given community or a given family, or etc. It runs the risk of further cementing the authority of traditional opinions, right? So the idea that someone has to put something stipulate something into a contract in order to get a right that should be fundamental to them, or the idea that one must ask for something that should for something that must be fundamental to them, or the idea that that there is because there is this contractual nature in which a woman may have to include stipulations in a nikah contract, that sort of admits to the fact that she is not on equal footing to begin with, right, in the contract. So So Ali proposes that a critical appraisal and analysis of the methods and rules of traditional jurisprudence would demonstrate that its doctrines are entirely inadequate then to serve, and this quote, a quote from her, that its doctrines are entirely inadequate to serve as the basis for laws governing Muslim families, communities, and societies today. Like the scriptural ethical tradition, feminist scholars have identified the limits of jurisprudence in defining and defending egalitarian gender ethics. These limitations are egalitarian Islamic gender ethics. These limitations are a consequence of the historical context in which the schools of jurisprudence emerged. However, pre-modern jurisprudence has contemporary consequences and forces feminist scholars to ask whether a tradition formed to support patriarchal social structures is capable of producing egalitarian gender ethics. Okay, so moving on to yet another genre, which is gender debates in the genre of theology or kalam, philosophical ethics. Although kalam is not directly about people, right? Kalam is about God, much less about gender per se. Many of the debates within this genre are relevant to gender ethics in Islam, right? The central questions in the genre of kalam is, what is the nature of God, right? What does the nature of God tell us about divine intent for the universe and humanity? The way that Muslims have imagined God, right, as documented in the kalam genre, becomes about human relationships to God as well as access to God. Authority also becomes about authority to speak for or act on behalf of God, and so on and so on. Right. And so those are very gendered issues as well. Right. So there are a few vital issues regarding the concept of God that manifest in Muslim understandings of gender and gender roles, namely the gendered male language and understanding of God in masculine terms. Right. The concept of oneness or tawheed, right, and relatedly, the notion of God's absolute authority and will, and how will is embodied and enacted by humans, right? So that would be khilafa or vicegerency or vice regency, or stewardship, translated khilafa in many ways. Language and pronouns for the divine were among the first issues that Muslim feminist theologians across, feminist theologians across religious traditions, but including in Muslim feminist theologians, grappled with in coming to terms with the patriarchal nature of scriptural interpretation, right? In questioning male pronouns used in tafsir, exegesis, right, and in everyday language and thought, Muslim feminist theologians were not just questioning a patriarchal intellectual tradition, but exposing a deep theological and philosophical assumptions that many Muslims make, that God is male. Although the Muslim tradition rejects anthropomorphization of God, right? And God is not a father, and God does not beget, nor is begotten. We know that. Lam yalid wa lam yulad. Using female pronouns seems really absurd to many people, revealing the idea, right? And Amina Wadud has written at length about this, revealing the idea that the use of the male pronoun is not arbitrary, it's normative. So ramifications of male normativity in the conception of God has had consequences as far as Muslim men's self-perception as the representatives of God's plan for humanity, society, and their families, in the form of male-oriented concept of khilafa. They, might self-project. The scholars of pre-modern scholars, as well as contemporary scholars, might project this male-oriented notion of God onto themselves, right? So in the form of male-oriented concept of khilafa, right? Consequently, Muslim men have viewed themselves in their description of God and in God's intent for humanity Although the Quranic concept of khilafa, or vicegerency, can be construed as a gender-neutral responsibility of every human being to be a trustee or a moral agent of God's justice, as Amina Wadud has argued, in practice, the role of Khalifa, or the public title that's associated with Khalifa, right, that involves being God's stewards of society, of the earth, of Muslims, has only been played by men. And this fact also relates to political leadership, which often is construed as sort of a peripheral concern for Muslim women, or for Muslim feminists, or in Islamic feminism. Political ethics is not usually a typical topic, but it is fundamental to the idea about their status and relationship to the divine. Relatedly, the idea that divine authority has been invested only in men manifests as justification for male superiority of their intellect, strength, and rulership over women. A salient critique of gender hierarchy as mandated by the divine is Wadud's perspective on Muslim belief in Tawheed, right? Divine unity, which she calls the Tawheedic paradigm. She argues that the most fundamental aspect of Islam is belief in one God, right? That we would probably all agree on that. And she argues that Tawheed requires us to believe in gender equality. She reasons that all human beings must be equal if there is a singular Lord. That is, no humans, quote unquote, like lord over others, right? Including men over women, or free persons over the enslaved, and so on and so forth, right? Consequently, when a person seeks to place him or herself above another, it either means the divine presence is removed or ignored, or that the person who imagines his or herself above others suffers from the egoism of shirk, or idolatry, right? Thus, gender hierarchy violates Tawheed, right? Because it invests moral and spiritual superiority in men, despite the impossibility for Muslim women to believe in any superior power other than God. So in the adjacent genre of philosophical ethics, akhlaq, women are likewise excluded from the path of ethical refinement. And as I've shown in my book, Gendered Morality, pre-modern Muslim ethicists cut women off from the Creator's plan for humanity as they invested khilafa in elite men on the basis of their higher rational capacity, while prescribing an instrumental role for women to serve their husbands on the basis of their deficient capacity for rationality. I argue that this seemingly time-bound marital arrangement has far-reaching consequences on Muslim understandings of how existence and roles in life are gendered and hierarchical. Elite men in particular. I'm not talking about all men, right? So Muslim ethicists, pre-modern Muslim ethicists, argued that elite men are also meant to rule over lower classes of men in the homosocial male public arena, as well as all enslaved persons, because of their supposedly higher intellects. While hierarchy may seem like a logical or natural order of society, it often the criteria used to determine who counts as elite or worthy of occupying higher status perpetuates the exclusion of women and non-elites. It is also based on a definition of rationality that is sort of cyclical as it is exclusionary, right? Elite men are the most rational in this cosmology, and rationality is defined as perfect manhood, right? It's this cyclical thing that pre-modern akhlaq writers have to philosophize about. And so I'm going to pause there, actually, and I have more lecture to get through, but I want to pause there for any questions so far, because before I move on to horizons and sort of new ethical paradigms that are emerging from within Muslim discourse. Should I field questions, or Amani, you want to do that? Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Yes, actually, Amani does that, but I'm not sure if she's there.
Okay, I'm
So,
happy to do it. I saw a hand, Tamara.
yeah,
Yeah. So I was wondering if you could say more about why gender inequality violates Tawhid, because I can kind of see this being true in the Akbarian understanding of Tawhid. If the doctrine of Wahdat al-Wujud is true, then
Mhm.
it's practically impossible for there to be any kind of inequality. But if it's a more limited and non-monistic understanding of Tawhid, then I don't really see why that must be the case.
Yeah,
Go
I don't.
into
Yeah,
detail.
I think that's a great question. I don't think Amina Wadud is diving too deeply into the philosophical discussion about why Tawhid would violate sorry, why gender hierarchy would violate Tawhid insofar in as much as she talks about Buber, and she talks about sort of other sorts of ways of getting at it. But I think that later versions of her discussion sort of dive more deeply into it, and she's coming at it from a very Sufi perspective herself, I believe. But I agree with you in that I think that one of the more deeply philosophical ways to approach the subject is to think about wahdat al-wujud, right? Which is like the unity of all being, the emanation of all matter, all matter, all being, all existence coming and emanating from the one, and therefore, and even the crazy thing is that that pre-modern the akhlaq genre, for example, people like Ghazali, or even people like Nasiruddin Tusi and Davani and people like that were they would admit to the fact that they would even write, all matter is created equal, and God, and the reason for that is because God exerted the same energy into creating one molecule over the other, right? Like it's the same. And so, and then within the same breath, right, they're talking about hierarchy of human existence, right? And how, some people are better than others because God gave them more rationality versus, and not only the people, right, but like, certain plants are better than others, and certain, animals are better than others, and there's this like whole hierarchy of, like great chain of being type of discourse going on there, that is still referring to God, and God, God being the origin of everything, but that the recipients of all of, I guess, God's blessings, right, are receiving it in um unequal measure because of how much rationality they have, how much initiative they have, how much of one humor they may have over the other. And so um and so it is a violation of Tawhid insofar as we think about the metaphysics of creation, right? But it may not necessarily be a violation if we are not thinking about God in those ways, right? And so that's why it is paramount for Muslim feminist thinkers to engage with topics that are seemingly having nothing to do with gender and gender relations, right? It's important to think about kalam, and it's important to think about philosophical issues because it ultimately comes down to a vision, like a vision for humanity, and the vision for humanity is one that is fraught with all kinds of problematic hierarchies.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting answer. A lot to think about.
Dr. Zahra, there are some questions in the chat box. If you see
Yeah,
it fit, you can refer to them.
sure. Going up to the top here, Julius wrote yesterday, Dr. Asfaruddin said that male pronouns are the ones that Allah used to just refer to God's self, and when he revealed the Quran to the Prophet. Okay, so is it linguistically accurate that, yes, so sure. I mean, it's linguistically accurate in the sense that we translate male, we translate the pronoun who into as he, right? And God is using that term. And God also uses we, God also uses they, God also uses I, as all these pronouns in the Quranic text. Now, the fact that we translate who as he and not who as she, right, is a linguistic choice as well. Of course, in some languages, there is, a gender neutral third person pronouns, like in Persian, oo is oo, no matter what. It's a gender neutral term. But and it's a singular, it's still a singular, it's not they. But that being said, even in Arabic, right, when you never disrespectfully say, Allah huwa, right? You don't, because you don't diminish God to being huwa as like a male pronoun. You say Allahu, right, as to be more respectful, to sort of imply that God is above this male third party pronoun, right? And so that may be linguistically inaccurate in that sense, to say that God uses male pronouns to describe God's self. I think that a lot of energy has been spent on translation and the discussion of translation and pronouns, and I feel like the primary issue that we need to come away with is not so much about what's going on in terms of pronouns, because there is a way to describe God in gender neutral terms, but really for us to notice that regardless of how God is describing God's self in the Quran, right? It is most certainly not in male terms. In terms of examples, it's not just about pronouns, right? It's also about like how we think of God, right? I mean, yes, there is some anthropomorphization, right? Like there's a throne mentioned in the Quran that the God is presumably sitting on that throne, potentially. There is a hand. There is also God's view, right? God is seeing certain things, right? So we anthropomorphize for our needs. Like we have to understand God in some way, right? So God uses these terms to describe what's going on and God's nature, and so we base kalam off of that. And in that realm, however, we should take notice of when we are gendering God in addition to anthropomorphizing in other ways. And it's in that gendering that you get these problematic sort of egotistical reflections upon usurping God's word, or being able to interpret God's intent as as requiring hierarchy and so on. Another question. There's another one about pronouns. I think I've said enough about that. With all these different sources that for religious authority, scripture, hadith, law, morality, where do you see Muslim feminists can get the most ground? I think that I don't think that it's any one genre will do any trick, right? If there were such a thing, we would be free from the fetters of oppression. I think that we need to study multiple genres and have multiple approaches always. I think that Islamic ethics is a very useful lens through which we can think about both our like ethical moral values and what we call Islamic, but also how we think about the various genres of existing Islamic thought, and whether or not and how, and one of the things that thinking through Islamic ethics does for us actually is a methodological thing, which is we're thinking more philosophically than what typical gender scholars or scholars of gender in Islam do, right? Scholars of gender in Islam usually specialize in one of these genres or multiple of these genres, or, you know, contemporary issues and so on, and less so on like in philosophical terms. And I think that it's really important to bring a philosophical approach to all of these genres, but as well as in philosophy itself, in order to sort of take a broader view. So that's how I'll answer that question. Let's see. How can contemporary Muslim societies reconcile Quranic principles, prophetic traditions, and jurisprudence with modern challenges? I think I'll come back to that question. That's a huge one, and technologically, while maintaining authenticity in religious praxis. I think that it's not an either or. I don't think that people should consider, oh, how should we balance our tradition with the modern and the new? I mean, the tradition has always been around, and every moment is modern, right? Like every moment is new. So like there is always flux and there is always change. It's not like there is this like thing in the past that is Islamic tradition and then now there's us, right? There is always been a relationship to the tradition, and that relationship has always been changing. So that's important to recognize. Is the oneness of human nafs related to Tawheed? So nafs is within a philosophical ethics tradition, and I'm not talking about Sufism, in which nafs has its own definitions and discussion, but within a philosophical ethics tradition of Islam, that genre defines nafs as the self, and not always the egotistical self, which is how it's thought of in the Sufi genres, but in akhlaq, in the akhlaq tradition, the nafs is the self that is just the individual personhood. Perhaps you can think of it in terms of God as like each person is created sort of individually, and has a soul that is that God, you know, breathes into life, sort of on an individual and collective humanity sort of basis. Okay, so the next question in Arabic, the singular, and okay, so I'm going to skip over, oh, and actually, no, that's not a Tawheed question. So in Arabic, singular entities are masculine, plurals can be feminine. So it works within the wider system of the language. Yeah, so that comment is specifically about how, like the tainting of the pool idea, right? Like if there's a room full of women and there's one male, then all of a sudden we use male collective pronouns. That clearly is a and that clearly is meant to sort of address the fact that how come so much of the Quran is addressed to men and not to women specifically, and the idea is that it's also addressed to women because it's inclusive of women. All right, and there's one last question I see here. What do you think, can the culture of religion change with the culture of tradition over time? I think that the time is going, but the truth of Allah is always with us. I think that we can modify the culture, but not the norm of God. I think that clearly God is absolute, and there is no like way that we can mess with God, much less even, you know, like what we can, however, do is think about how we think of God, right? We're just lowly human beings on, you know, we don't have much in the way of going for us, especially since humanity has been doing so poorly lately, on an ethical level, on ethical standpoint. But I think that we definitely can modify the way that we operate as society. And is that a reflection of our values and the way that we think of God and what we imagine God's intent for our society to be? Sure. Like, that's the whole project, right? Like, that's the whole project of what Muslim ethicists might want to do, or is to think about, you know, philosophical sort of substrates of how we incorporate the tradition in imagining and reimagining our society in a way that would fit within an Islamic ethos, right? Like, and what that actually means for us. Back to my lecture. So I want to pivot to ethical horizons, which was actually the title and topic that I was given to today to talk about, and not so much stuff about the past, but more so about horizons. And horizons for me is like future. So let me start with two new currents in gender ethics in Muslim discourses. One is ethics of care, and the other is love ethics, which originate in feminist philosophy and Black feminist scholarship, sort of respectively. And they made their way into Muslim ethics because of numerous overlaps in ethics concerns, as well as numerous overlaps in terms of, who we're talking about, who are the practitioners. So they may be, Muslim, coming from feminist philosophy, who happen to be Muslim, or Black feminist scholarship, which also might happen to be Muslim. So ethics of care has its roots in feminist philosophy, but it's made its appearance in Islamic thought, coined by Carol Gilligan and further detailed by Nell Noddings. The focus of the ethics of care is on the compelling moral salience of attending to and meeting the needs of particular others for whom we take responsibility. An ethics of care offers a framework to derive moral values from Muslim women's work to resist oppression and address the needs of their communities. For example, Amina Wadud, right, whom we talked about earlier, frames African American Muslim women's grassroots initiatives that respond to community needs like Truth and Muslim Women United as an ethics of care that sort of predates slavery and is reflected in the African idiom, "It takes a village to raise a child." Wadud identifies two dynamics present in an ethics of care: the need of one member, one family, or the communities, and the development of the collective to help and support. In detailing the work of Black Muslim women leading grassroots initiatives to address food insecurity, raise funds for medical care, create support networks for fellow Muslim women, Wadud proposes that these leaders' work reflects an ethics of care defined by an approach to leadership that is in concert with other Muslims. It does not impose authority and emphasizes a unity that is never used for uniformity, as demonstrated in the inclusive nature of organization events, right? So Amina Wadud's assessment of Black Muslim women's community work suggests that Muslim ethics of care is concerned with addressing community needs in a manner that does not recreate social hierarchies or oppressive power dynamics. So this is sort of like civil society, 2.0, which is in which you have people who are caring for one another in, very difficult, challenging life circumstances, and that care actually is translating into the kind of ethos that that builds is coming from an Islamic ethos that translates into building a society that is more in line with Muslim values. Muslim love ethics is a new current of gender ethics that seeks to subvert oppressive practices out of love for the tradition and fellow Muslims with an eye toward the future. Muslim love ethics is not just concerned with assigning moral language to everyday women's resistance as the focus of an ethics of care, but in its contemporary use is concerned with imagining the moral language that characterizes an egalitarian future. This definition of Muslim love ethics draws on contemporary and Black feminist scholarship of Jennifer Nash that approaches love and love politics as a guide for identifying the values and practices that ought to define a utopian future and assign normative moral value for what should and should not be the case. For Muslim feminist ethics, love ethics turns its focus to the moral language and values represented in Muslims' work to create and imagine alternative communities absent of oppression, rather than focusing on the moral language derived from their experiences of oppression. And here I'm drawing a lot from the work of scholar Iman Abdul Karim in describing love ethics in Black Muslim feminist communities in particular. And her work on Muslim women's participation in the Black Lives Matter movement from some years ago finds that Muslim women are creating their own, quote, their own practice of a love ethic, one that aims to create alternative communities and spaces that adopt a radiating approach toward inclusion that works to center the margins of the marginalized, unquote. Abdul Karim argues that BLM activists' commitment to centering the margins of the marginalized is a moral value that defines their vision of an egalitarian community. And focus on uplifting the margins of the marginalized, it ultimately means that everybody is uplifted, right? So her work demonstrates, Abdul Karim's work demonstrates that love ethics can be used to consider the moral values of Muslim women develop in an attempt to create egalitarian communities, in addition to those derived from their work to resist oppression. Love ethics' emphasis on assigning moral language to oppression-free communities is also reflected in the emergence of Muslim futurism as a movement, a contemporary art and aesthetic movement, for example, such as Mipsters and the Alhamdu Project, that propose a gender and race-inclusive ethical framework. Drawing on Afrofuturism, Muslim futurism is concerned with the practices, events, and trends that characterize a future in which Muslims emerge from and evolve past contemporary social conditions of oppression. Ethics of care and love make two important contributions to Muslim feminist ethics. First, both frameworks allow feminist scholars to explore what moral language and virtue practices can be defined through social relationships and Muslim women's social justice work, not just textual analysis. Thus, as I discussed earlier, if the Islamic intellectual tradition emerged within patriarchal social conditions, right, patriarchal social historical conditions and produced gender ethics that privilege and maintain male authority, assigning moral language to Muslim women's acts of resistance and imaginings of an oppression-free future, right, offers new woman-centered methods for deriving moral values that support egalitarian social relations within an Islamic framework. I propose that, as I proposed in Gendered Morality, moving forward, attention to the category of gender requires a reimagination of Islamic ethics that is inclusive of women, non-elites, and individuals who may be marginalized on the basis of their gender, race, sexuality, physical, or cognitive abilities. These two currents, namely ethics of care and ethics and love ethics, in Muslim ethical thought and praxis, are already doing this work with origins in Black feminist theory. They require Muslim feminist ethics to account for race, sexuality, and other marginalized aspects of human existence in considering the moral language that support radically egalitarian social relationships. In accommodating the varieties of human experience that are gendered, at stake is accessibility to the good life, according to a Muslim ethos. And revealed within those concerns are questions of what does it mean to live an ethical life? What are moral imperatives and where do they come from? What is the role of religious tradition in Islam in ethics discourses? What tools do we have to interpret religious tradition, and who holds interpretive authority for the formation of ethics? These are questions that matter to all of us. So you might be thinking at this point, how is this angle of ethics any different from Islamic feminist thought in general, right? Or why ethics in particular? So I feel that a little bit more about ethics as a genre is warranted. So in addition to being analytical of principles, ethics is also aspirational, right? We have all heard of codes of ethical conduct or ethics boards of various kinds, like in hospitals or whatever, or at universities and stuff, ethics boards of various kinds that recommend guidelines for decision-making actions or behaviors, some of which are enforced or reinforced by laws, local laws, legislation, and so on, policies, through legal mechanisms, but many are not, right? And many ethics guidelines are just guidelines. Ethics are not always legally enforceable, and so it remains a genre of aspiration. How people will behave and act based on some values, and in our case, using an Islamic ethos, right? However that is defined. So then Islamic ethics encapsulates a philosophical approach to the tradition that always demands better. But Islamic ethics, as a methodological approach, also scrutinizes existing Muslim practices as to whether they live up to or misapply the logics and ethical principles underlying them. And I have plenty of examples of those, but we can talk about that. So it is both Islamic ethics approach is both a philosophy of Islamic value and a practice of adjusting praxis to bring it in line with those values, right? So at this point, I'd like to invite all of you to take a broad view of gender justice and Islamic feminism through the prism of ethics. And that means giving attention to topics other than what we typically refer to as gender-related topics, right? Not to say that we lose sight of these topics, right? There's real gender harm that is taking place, within the typical topics that we are, used to talking about, right? So like typical issues, right? So like while it's important to talk about things like marriage and divorce and sexuality and gender relations and power relations in family and women's rights in various contexts, it's perhaps equally important to discuss topics that are seemingly not so gender related, right? So things like medical ethics, technology ethics, economy and labor, the environment, right? These are not typically topics that Muslim feminists might be writing about, or they might have like peripheral interest. But when it comes to gender stuff, there's like not, clear overlap. But I think that there really is clear overlap, right? We can all sort of sit here, and I invite you to generate some scenarios with me. I mean, can you guys, and I'm going to sort of make this participatory, so please raise your hand and unmute and speak about this. Like, can you help me to generate scenarios in which there is a gender-based discrimination or harm done in, various arenas? And let's start with the first one I mentioned, medical ethics, right? Can you think of a scenario in which there is gendered problematic practices that might actually be governed through, thinking through medical ethics? Tamara, you had your hand up.
So the main two things I thought about are, first of all, the lack of research about female responses to drugs, to a variety of things, which leads to medicine mainly being tailored to men. I can't really think of how this might be connected to Islamic ethics, but I think it's a serious problem that would have to be dealt with. And the second thing is, for example, the tendency of certain doctors not to take pain reported by women seriously. Things like what's it called? The word doesn't occur to me. It's some kind of illness of the uterus. Let me know if you think of it. But the issue is that if pain isn't taken seriously, with the assumption that women are exaggerating or maybe even imagining it, then that is also a huge issue. And I think it's linked to assumptions about the judgment of women, about the intellectual capabilities of women. So I think you could connect that to Islamic ethics potentially. Well, to any ethics, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I think that those are really important scenarios, right? Because it doesn't jump out at us as we have thought of them in silos, right? As we have thought of these issues separately, right? Female responses to drugs, right? Why would we even care about that? Or pain reported by women not being taken seriously by care providers or whatever, right? No matter what kind of pain we're talking about, and that may or may not be particularly relevant, right? It may not be immediate, but when you are talking, like for example, as I've done research on on Muslim women's medical decision making and so on, right? This idea that that women have particular medical needs that are normatively ignored because medicine itself is very male dominated, right? The one question you can come at it from the perspective of why is that, you can think of it as why would that be, why is that something that Muslim ethicists should care about, right? Because it's not involving the religious tradition, but it is, right? I mean, there's experiences of life and death and medical decision making that people make on a daily basis that have to do with how they are imagining themselves, their lives, their relationship to the divine, and when to seek medical care, when to seek uh, uh, care for the body, when to face potentially racist medical caregivers, and so on and so forth. In that process, there's a lot of barriers too, right? There's financial barriers, there's racist barriers, and all kinds of barriers and access to healthcare. But if Muslim ethicists or if Muslim or Islamic feminist thinkers were to take up such an issue, it would not just be about speaking back to the non-Muslim other potentially, but also to own the fact that Muslims make decisions about their bodies and that those decisions are often gendered, right? And when you are talking about a dynamic potentially in a family, or whether it's like a decision to treat or a decision to do a certain procedure in your body, or it's a whether it's to move forward with a pregnancy, or whether it's to which might be doomed or something, or it's like how to deal with a miscarriage, or how to deal with somebody who is chronically ill. And and there are times in which the family dynamics at play, in which often what happens in some Muslim families is that when women in particular get sick, people don't know how to take care of them because women are usually the caretakers, right? So these are all dynamics that may or may not be necessarily related to philosophies and Islam and things that are theoretical, but they are in terms of our praxis, right? Like, who is getting care and good care? Is it not part of an Islamic ethos to take care of ourselves, right? And it certainly is, right? And so it's not to say that we can lump this all together with care ethics, but it is to say that, you know, that medical ethics is indeed one arena in which, you know, Muslim feminist thinkers ought to also involve themselves, because there are gendered oppressions, there are gendered discriminations that are taking place as well, that may, you know, that may be that they may be able to address, and may be able to say, okay, well, that's not Islamic, and let's talk about why. And it's not to say we're policing people's bodies, right? It's to say that, because a lot of people are doing that. A lot of people police Muslim women's bodies, right? It's you know, what they wear, what they do, how they dress, where they go, what they, you know, what they're lots of different actors, right? From the state all the way to, you know, themselves, right? Family in between, and communities, Muslim, whatever, Muslim, non-Muslim, all sorts of things, right? Are policing Muslim women and their bodies. So, you know, why wouldn't that be a topic of interest, right? And then let's talk about technology really quickly, right? Can anyone think of an example in which a Muslim woman would face an issue in particular involving technology? An issue of gender-based discrimination, or in which a Muslim woman is involved, involving technology. I'll give you a moment. Algorithmic bias. Amani came up with algorithmic bias. Absolutely. So you type in you know, a query, or you type in anything, a query, and it's not, and the response is from AI, or you know, is you know, first of all, providing you with answers that might be racist, providing you with answers that might be sexist, providing you with extra surveillance. Securitization is something that Amina said, is another example of, you know, there's a lot of technology involving surveillance of Muslim women, you know, and it's not just, it doesn't have to be done to Muslim women in order for Islamic feminists to care about a given issue, right? Because of the fact that on the one hand, we're all in this together, but on the other hand, if you consider Muslim women to be the recipients of extra scrutiny, extra layers of, multiple layers of post-colonial, post-colonial scrutiny, internalized sense of uh, of fighting against hierarchies that don't make sense, and things like that, and internalized senses of inferiority and all kinds of other layers of things, then it would only make sense to also care about how technology would, how we would interact with technology. So unwittingly and unknowingly, right? Each of these topics, like including technology, right, for example, and just the way, just algorithmic bias, and as an example, right, is already shaping the way that we think about things, right? Who's in charge? Who are the who holds power of information, power of narrative, of who is describing what, right? All of us are subject to that. And those of us who have historically come from more oppressed communities, and if you think about Muslim women, and who by and large happen to be women of color as well, right? That gets to be a form of invisible oppression, because it's not a person doing it to somebody. It's technology, right? It's the computers, it's the AI, it's our tech that's doing it. And so there isn't a face, but all of that is programmed by people. It's already included, like it's like programmed bias, programmed sexist or racist or anti-Muslim problems. And so, and that, all of that being imported into our homes and into our lives, right, creates further misinformation and access that, you know, I don't want us to necessarily get into the details of any given topic at the moment, but I want you guys to think about imagining how each of these issues does in fact affect the communities that are typically are the top of the communities that we're thinking about when we think of gender justice, right, in Islam. So like economy and labor is a great example, right? So like economy and labor, can you guys think of an example in which discussing or participation from Muslim women in particular in the ethics of talking about ethics of economy and labor would actually be beneficial to Muslim women? So I guess so I'll rephrase the question. So right now we're thinking about topics that are seemingly not so gender related, right? So or topics that Muslim feminist thinkers don't typically engage with, right? So like medical ethics, technology, we've talked about these two things, right? And I'm not diving deep into any of them, right? I haven't delved deep into medical ethics or ethics of technology either. But what some of the examples that you guys provided do for us is to help us think about how when we participate in the enterprise of thinking philosophically or thinking through Islamic ethics as a prism, we can think about as a lens, we can think about how we're affected by these discourses on our daily lives and how the tools of Islamic ethics, right, which again, to reiterate, are to, on the one hand, demand better, right, to pull things, demand better of the tradition, but also to scrutinize Muslim practices to scrutinize Muslim practices to see whether they live up to or misapply ethical principles, right? So are Muslims themselves, right, using medical technologies ethically? Are Muslims themselves practicing what do you call it? Are Muslims themselves practicing ethical, economic, and labor practices? Are they doing that? Are they engaging that? Is a Muslim who is an employer, is a Muslim who is a person in business, are they engaging in ethical business practices? Is that in line with Muslim ethos, right? All of these things are, we think a lot about each of these topics as separate from feminist issues, but they are in fact part of feminist issues, right? So if you can't think of an example for economy and labor, I was just thinking about a scenario in which Muslim women who are employed by a company that's engaged in some sort of unethical labor practices, whether it's, I don't know, like making them stand for hours or making them, or do something that is unfair, even if it's something simple like presenting on a topic that they are not prepared to talk about or whatever, right? And it's just unfair in that way, right? There are ways to think about, it's not to say that everything needs to be Islamic. It's to say that there is an ethos within Muslim practice of how to run businesses, how to participate in the economy, how to think about fair labor practices that affect both Muslim women, but also because Muslim feminist thinkers are the ones who think about issues of hierarchy and issues of power, and are the ones who are bringing issues of hierarchy and power and critiques of these things into infusing that into engagement with the tradition. We can also do that with multiple different topics, and it is actually from Islamic conviction of ethos of living a better life and wanting to have a better society that you have the ability to be thinking about these topics that are not typical of Muslim feminist thinkers, such as medical technology, technology, medical ethics, economy and labor, and so on. So that's really the point here. So I'll pause there and take more specific questions, because I feel like this exercise might be better.
If I may jump in real quick.
We're running out of time too, aren't we?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to point out, we are at the final 30-minute mark
Okay.
for our discussion today. I know time flies when we're having fun, and especially when we have such an engaging speaker. Genuinely, Zahra, I want to thank you for taking so many questions and being so engaged with our students here. And also to thank everyone in attendance for all of the incredibly thoughtful questions so far. It's truly been wonderful to see the discussion that ethics has inspired. So as we're entering into our final 30 minutes together today, please continue sharing your questions and your reflections. Feel free to go ahead and take advantage of the opportunity if you haven't had the chance to speak yet. And just be mindful of prioritizing your questions accordingly. Thank you.
Sure.
I have another question if there's no one else. So in general, I've been asking myself how it is, or no, actually, I've been asking myself what incentives might have been at play in the tendency of traditional scholars to read these misogynistic meanings into the Quran, because to me it's honestly, I'm astounded that they managed to do this, even though the text is so obviously egalitarian. Was it intentional blindness? Were they aware? Were there any competing interpretations, any egalitarian interpretations, or were they truly convinced that that was the only possible interpretation? And yes, so basically, I'm wondering, of course, in general, the main motivation must have been to maintain dominion over women, but in what respects in particular? What do you...
I think it's really easy for us to sort of retroactively say, oh, like the pre-modern exegetes and jurists were all sexist and problematic and stupid. I mean, they weren't stupid, right? And they were not uniformly sexist either. But what they were was products of their time, right? And I think that it's when you say the Quran is so obviously egalitarian, it is to you. And and it is, I mean, it is to me too, but it is, it is to you. And when you say that, and it is not, and it is less so to someone else, right, who is going to project themselves onto the text based on their observations, the way they think that society works, the way they think that society should work. And there is this desire for us to think about, I mean, on the one hand, there's this desire for us to think about Islam coming in a vacuum and all of a sudden, there was equality. But it didn't, right? It came in an existing society that had its own hierarchies, it had its own problematic gender dynamics, and some of that the Quran modified for the better, and some of that the Quran modified for absolute equality, but it was not understood as such. And some of that the Quran didn't touch necessarily, although it was like implied, right? And so like the greatest example is the slavery example, right? I mean, the Quran is not saying slavery is outlawed, right? Like no more slavery. It's saying, things like things like, oh, it's good to free a slave, right? Or the prophet didn't say, I didn't outlaw slavery altogether, rather when he could, he freed slaves, right? When he could, he bought emancipation. When he could, so there is this idea that with the coming of Islam, you have this ethos of abolition without absolute abolition, right? And likewise with other forms of problematic hierarchies, right? I mean, the Quran is in a way like helping people out a lot, but not, but may not have gone all the way. And that's not to say that it's time bound and therefore we should not, pay attention to it. It's to say that when it came about in a particular time, and the ethos that we build off of it, which includes the prophet, peace be upon him's own ethics and own like practices and stuff, right, as well as all sorts of other philosophical issues that come about when we think about the Quran in a broader sense, in a both a cosmic sense as well as like a historical sense. Then you can see how its interpretation is really based on who's reading it and when they're reading it and how they're reading it.
Yeah. I should be clear, I wasn't meaning to imply that the traditional interpretations were in any way unintelligent or anything like that. I'm aware that the reason I see the Quranic text as egalitarian is that I've mainly been exposed to these egalitarian readings. I guess I was just wondering about more psychological incentives for preferring misogynistic readings.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I was just describing it in more extreme terms because I think that it's easy to dismiss, and I think that so, there hasn't been enough work done on comparing some of the other historically problematic things that the jurists may have said, or like the exegetes may have concluded, right? Like people, like the feminist scholars can only do so much, right? Like they've pointed out, okay, these are some really problematic, sexist things that, exegetes have said about the Quran and about their interpretation. But like, what about other things, right? And which will help you to think about how their worldview was very limited and to what they knew, as is ours, right, is limited to what we know. And so like doing a comparison there of, whether it's technology or like or even astronomy, right? Like the way that pre-modern thinkers thought of the verses about the heavenly bodies and like the bodies in motion and like references to like the seven heavens and like the and the earth-like bodies out there that are revolving, and like pre-moderns thought of those verses in very particular ways, and we think of those verses in very different ways because our technology has changed, and and our telescopes have changed, and we know that there's like planets out there and so on, so and so like we see those verses in a different light now. And likewise, people are seeing verses that imply hierarchy, or that they involve hierarchy, or they talk about society in a particular way, reflecting their own values, their own worldviews. And so like we do the same thing with it that we do, other verses. It's just this happens to be about visions of society, and and it's a lot more painful to I guess accept misinterpretations or so, for our purposes.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Dr. Zahra, if I can turn your attention to a few new questions. I'm sure some of them have been waiting for a response on those. And then once we get through those, then we can see how much time we have left and how many more questions we can take from the rest of the students.
Sure. So there's one from Amina here. I see. Oh, actually before that, Julius wrote, what's an example of a gendered experience of death, loss, or grief? Oh gosh, there's and the Fatma Keita wrote, I would love to know how Islamic ethics could be applied to gendered experiences of death, loss, and grief. So experiences of death, loss, and grief is in fact it is highly gendered, right? I mean, the way that we grieve loss, the way, first of all, the way that we grieve loss, the way that we even think about the way that we even think about decisions about death and who is deciding for whom, and you know, whether it's like to pull the plug or to stop medications or whatever. And you know, and there is obviously a lot of discussion about how end of life care should be conducted within a Muslim framework. You know, a lot of Muslim ethicists will say things like, oh well, you know, you should exhaust every avenue because that is the principle of following the principle of preservation of life, which is a cornerstone of Islamic ethics, Islamic law, excuse me. We should, in our ethical practices and in our medical decision making, we should try exhaust every avenue in order to preserve life. And so it becomes an issue of like, okay, well, when there is a point at which, at some point in medical practices, and sometimes in some case scenarios in which there is past a point of no return, in which, you know, no medical intervention is actually going to assist the preservation of life, and that it is only for you know, reducing harm or reducing pain, and death is imminent. And I'm not talking about, you know, several years in advance, but like when death is actually imminent within a matter of a few days or weeks, and or even a few hours for that matter. And so, you know, and when that is the case, and you know, decisions about when to stop treatments and so on, is something that people do think about, and that oftentimes can be a gendered experience because of who is making decisions, who is speaking, who is being spoken for, and by whom. You know, whether or not fathers or husbands or brothers or sons are making overwhelming decisions for the female members of their family, or whether meanwhile, perhaps in some case scenarios, female members of the family are the primary caretakers of their loved ones, and yet they may not be the decision makers. You know, all of these are not necessarily related to Islam, not necessarily related to Islamic, particular verse in the Quran, or even a hadith or anything like that. But these are practices that Muslims might be engaging in. And the question is does it fit within an Islamic ethos of respecting people's the integrity of somebody's life, right? Who is making decisions for somebody else, and for what reasons, and for what and why. Especially when it comes to life and death, this becomes really salient. It's different if a father is making a decision about their daughter where she's going to go to college, but it's a totally different scenario if a father is making a decision about whether or not to pull the plug on his terminally ill child, right? Yeah, it's a different order of magnitude in terms of decision making. And so, and again, while none of that may be directly related to any given verse or any given, you know, Islamic thing, it's all part of Muslim practice. And so the question is, are Muslim ethics, right, in line with principles and values that Muslims themselves are holding? And if and when they are not, right, to ask the question of like, well, how do we bring them in line, right? What kinds of philosophical issues need to be addressed, right? Is it hierarchy? Is it power relations? Is it is it a family dynamic? Is it respecting and giving back to those who cared for you, for example? Is that an important value to uphold? So these are all issues, and of course the experience of death and loss and grief is also highly gendered, because in some Muslim communities, women may not be allowed to visit cemeteries or go to funerals or attend janazah salat, funeral prayers. And how does their loss and grief look if they are unable to do those things? And I'm not saying that that those practices are uniformly bad, but sometimes that grieving process might be interrupted, especially if there is in fact no impediment or to participating in the grief process. Then how is that how is it fair to somebody who is grieving, to not allow them to be part of that process if that's what they need, right? So the question is, how do we support people who are how do we support women? How do we support people who are experiencing death, loss, and grief in ways that are not reinforcing problematic gendered stereotypes, like the idea that women cannot control themselves in a cemetery and therefore must not attend cemetery, right? Like that may or may not be the case, right? But you cannot blanket assume, right? So these are the kinds of questions that come to mind. A next question was, in your view, are Islamic ethics related to and influenced by Sharia? So Sharia is to me, as a scholar of Islam in Islamic studies, Sharia is just the way of God, right? Like literally translating it, which but I know that you mean Islamic law, perhaps, or because you're contrasting it with ethics in this question. So perhaps, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Islamic ethics is related to Sharia insofar as it may scrutinize principles of Sharia to see whether or not scenarios in life are actually in which Sharia rules or guidelines might be, applied, are actually living up to those guidelines, right? So, for example, I can think of a scenario, and I'll just bring up an example, which is really easy for me to bring up, which is the use of birth control. Okay, let's talk about use of birth control. So like for example, yes, there are people who say that birth control is totally permissible in Islam because people in the time of the Prophet were practicing withdrawal during sexual intercourse, and therefore, and the Prophet was asked about it, and he said, yes, that's fine. And so therefore, practicing a form of birth control by analogy, via medication or barrier or other methods is totally fine because it was a practice that the Prophet was fine with, and probably practiced himself to be, if we want to speculate, considering he only had a few children with only one woman. So, okay, fine. But on the other hand, there are people who say that, well, it's not, there are fatwas, right? And that say that, birth control should be used sparingly because of this principle within Islamic law that we should proliferate the society, Muslim society, and that we should have as many children as possible. We should not, if you want to delay, and this was a real fatwa that I read. If you want to delay having children for a time, that's fine, but you shouldn't use it permanently because it's problematic, and therefore something like getting one's tubes tied or a hysterectomy or is actually impermissible because it interferes with this idea of proliferating with the society. Now, okay, I understand, but however, birth control is widely practiced amongst Muslims, and maybe not permanently, but it is widely practiced. And as far so the difference between that and a permanent thing, is it the question of is it like, we could go down the fiqh, the jurisprudence road of thinking about, okay, it is a Sharia principle to proliferate the community. It is a Sharia principle to preserve life, and to preserve life at all costs, right? On the other hand, the ethics approach, right, would think of individual scenarios and would not be like, okay, here's a blanket fatwa, or here's a blanket reason, right? Right. It would look at individual scenarios, right? What if somebody has already proliferated the ummah, right? Has already had children? Wouldn't you argue that their job is done, and therefore it doesn't matter if they get their tubes tied or if they use birth control permanently? Like, what's up with that? Or what if somebody what if it would cause actual harm to their body in order to have children, right? So, or what if they can't afford it? Okay, there are verses in the Quran that discourage people from not having children because of worries of financial, that God will provide, and so on and so forth. But does that mean that you have children knowing that you can't provide for them? Okay, that is a question. So the ethics perspective is different from Sharia in that it takes into account these individual situations, right? And people do argue that, oh, well, fatwas do that too. You can come up with your personal problem and present it to a sheikh, and the sheikh will say, whatever they want about, and rule on the matter. But when you look at that genre, the fatwa banks and responsa, oftentimes they may not be able to get to the heart of the actual concern that is at play, and they're responding with oftentimes what I would consider to be cookie cutter kinds of responses to particular scenarios, right? So the reason why they do that is because they want their rulings to apply to as many people as possible for whom that issue might be the case. But it may or may not actually respond to a given person's concern, which might be, I've already had children, or it might be, I don't want this for myself in my life because of XYZ reason. And so, but if you take a Sharia approach, it is in effect, it might actually make you feel bad for not wanting children for XYZ reason, because you have to proliferate the ummah. And if you're not doing it for some reason, you have to have a good reason. Whereas in the ethics approach, it takes into consideration an individual's willingness based on their own given life and their circumstances. And so it's coming from principles of raham and care and other sort of values that might serve as guiding principles and not legal principles, if that makes sense, in terms of distinction between ethics and law. Okay, so next question. When it comes to ethics of performing business, would the issues like there has to be 2 women witnesses when it comes to trade, debt, be something addressed in Islamic ethics as it is written explicitly in the Quran, and how do we best go about it? Okay, so the 2 women witnessing something, because if one forgets, one reminds the other. Yeah, it's in the Quran, sure. On the other hand, but is that, do we have to ask ourselves the question of, do we make that to be the case for all types of dealings in which women are involved? Is one question. Another question we have to ask is, if the Quran is saying that, does that mean that doesn't apply to other people as well, who might be just as forgetful, potentially? Right? I know that men are just as forgetful as women might be. That's not particularly, that's not particularly a gendered attribute. And yet the text might be coming from a perspective in which that is assumed to be a gendered attribute, or the text is saying that and we're interpreting that as being Allah is saying something gendered here. Okay. But Allah might not be saying something gendered and we just don't get it. And so it might be something about something else, or it might be specific to that thing, and or a particular scenario, or the moment in which it was revealed, or you know, in which there did happen to be two forgetful women, or one forgetful woman was witnessing something, right? So there is a very so there is a sort of a question as to whether or not we can generalize something that that appears to us as gendered in the Quran, and whether we can generalize that as being gendered for all time, and that's a gendered thing. But that being said, is that something to be addressed in Islamic ethics? So the Islamic ethics response would be like, let's think about practices, and are people forgetful, and are people who are other than women forgetful? Sure, they are. Are women forgetful? Sure, they can be. What's exactly at underlying this potentially, you know, this Quranic verse about one forgetting and the other, or having to remind the other, right? It's the forgetfulness that's the problem here, right? But extrapolating it to all women for all time is problematic. That's like us doing that, right? So so the underlying issue here is about witnessing and forgetfulness, right? Now, are there other ways to witness things nowadays? Yeah, sure, right? Like, you can record something, you can have multiple witnesses, and if you have multiple witnesses of an event, does that mean that you like, oh, let's just talk about a nikah contract, for example, right? The fact that two male witnesses are required to sign a nikah contract, which is perfectly fine in and of itself. Could we potentially have two women signing the nikah as witnesses, given the fact that potentially, if it is in fact a public nikah in which, you know, it took place in front of a giant audience, in which the audience was a mixed gendered audience, or was even a predominantly male audience, does it matter who is signing if there were lots of witnesses? You know, in practice, oftentimes, mostly only men sign, right? Now, is that a problem? Not necessarily. But again, is it a problem if women are signing it? Again, not necessarily, right? It depends on the situation, the scenario, and to what degree are we following, to what degree are we following this idea that women are forgetful? And if we should not, if we do agree that that is not necessarily the case, then, you know, then we can have women sign, right? And especially if we're talking about a giant audience in which there were many witnesses, then what is wrong with women witnessing, right? So so these are all questions to ask. I think the question is not so much about oh, I am in favor of, you know, X, Y, or Z, but it's to say, and I'm providing a ruling, but it is to say what an ethics approach provides us is with a set of tools to ask questions about particular practices and particular scenarios in which we can ask more intelligent questions about what we should do and how we should go about doing something, given like the underlying issues, given the assumptions that everybody is making in following a given ruling or a verse or whatever. Okay, any other questions? I think we have time for one more. It's 25 past the hour, so.
Last chance, everyone. Take advantage while you can.
I can offer a question. I'm wondering what you think is the most important thing we can all take away from this. Like if we remember one thing, yeah, what should it be?
I would say a few things, right? So there's nothing wrong with oh, okay. So I would say it's really important to one dive into issues that are not obviously about gender, right? Because ultimately they will be. It's just a matter of figuring out like what point down the line. Um and so one the other ones are to think about Islamic ethics as an organic thing that does incorporate, the tradition, engages with the tradition on a critical level. It's there to scrutinize and understand how the intellectual tradition engages with the scriptural tradition, engages with history, and so on, historical context, and so on. But it also is there, it serves as a critique of how people are engaging, ignoring, interpreting, applying the tradition. Like you always are wanting better, including of yourself, like always. And of course, it starts with yourself. Like you always want to be making sure that your practices, that you're not engaging in something that is seemingly, because everybody is doing it, problematic, right? I mean, like there's so many examples. I can't even begin. Uh the way that we incorporate technology, the way that we use social media, the way that we use AI, or is one example. Like we don't think of that as being a gender issue of Islamic feminist ethics or anything like that. But when you think about how we use it, or what gets said on it, or how what kinds of things are used to perpetuate it, or how social media dominates our lives and controls our lives, and like what we, all of that is problematic. And so, and we can think about that in terms of Islamic ethics perspectives as well. And then another thing would be to think about Muslim feminist ethics as being something that is not outside of the tradition. It's within the tradition, and I say that because there is so much criticism of Muslim feminist thought in general of being outside the tradition, and that's why Muslim feminist thought began with the Quran and began with, because it's really it is trying to speak back to this idea that feminism is something that, is a Western construct and is imposed upon Muslims because Muslims were backwards, blah, blah, blah. And that in itself is a narrative, and it's a narrative that if you reject it, then you can actually begin to embrace egalitarian within Islam. And but it's hard to do when there's so much scrutiny upon Muslims. So yeah.
Thank you.
Dr. Zahra, thank you so much for that that thoughtful response, and also just in general, all of the incredible discussion that you've inspired here today. As a closing question, I would like to ask you the same question that I'm asking every single one of our lecturers this week, which is that if you can impart one message on the next generation of Muslim women and girls, what would it be?
It's hard, I think, because I would say try as much as possible to build up yourself and resilience. And resilience only comes with building up yourself. And which, comes through education, which comes through, building up your loved ones and your supports, and shoring up your family and shoring up your chosen family and all of your loved ones, and creating a sense of community. But it is also a lot of responsibility, and I think that, yeah, like, the world sucks, and there shouldn't be so much responsibility on any given person's shoulders to, like, create the world that you want to live in. And like that's a lot of responsibility on somebody, like the whole like, create the world that you want to live in, full of.
No pressure.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what, especially when, you're up against megaliths, right? Like, how's that going to happen? The point is, to focus on what you can control, right? Like, to what you can actually do, right? Which is to take care of yourself and those around you in a way that, is consistent with the world you want to live in. And I'm saying this, and I'm saying this in increasingly in a world in which that is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, right? Like, you step outside your house and all of a sudden you're in all kinds of oppressions. And so maybe it is just your home, right? But that means, like, raising the boys right. That means raising the girls right. That means, like, not, nurturing the family relationships in a way that is uplifting to everybody in the family. And as a means to, and by family, I don't just mean actual blood relations. I also mean, like, chosen family, and friends, and to, like, uplift each other in that way, as a way to create that resilience that is harder and harder to come by. Yeah.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And it can be a tough question, actually, to try to distill that into one message. And, I think you accomplished that beautifully.
For now, we'll see. If you ask me
For
that, yeah.
TBD.
Yeah, exactly.
Once again, Dr. Zahra, thank you so much for joining us today and for guiding us through just such a powerful and thought-provoking exploration. I mean, I think, everyone here can agree with me that, your work and this talk has really challenged us to think beyond the surface level reforms. And you've truly invited us to imagine what just and compassionate communities could look like for us, that are grounded in ethics, that honor Muslim women's dignity. So thank you again for making it so accessible for us, and presenting it in a way that I think we can all really not only understand, but harness and leverage in our own lives and for our own communities. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and giving me the space and time to think about these things with you.
Absolutely. And with that, we are officially completed with half of this course. So we have 3 more lectures to go, inshallah, and we have some really exciting talks coming up. For all of our students, I hope that today's discussion has sparked new questions for you to think about, how we embody justice in our daily lives and in our relationships. And I'm sure that today's conversation is going to help inspire some of the thought-provoking questions that we're going to confront in the days to come. So get ready, because tomorrow we're going to continue the journey by focusing specifically on gender equality and justice in the Quran. And that talk will be with Dr. Julianne Hammer. So I look forward to seeing you all at this time tomorrow, inshallah. Thanks again for all of your curiosity and engagement today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zahra. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you,
See you all
Amani.
tomorrow.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Assalamu alaikum.